Okay, so we'll now talk about the way we prepare data for editing, and then we'll review some of the tools and things within the Edit tab in ArcGIS Pro. So we're now in ArcGIS Pro, and we're ready to make sure our data is ready for editing and that everything's set up the way we want it to be. So the first thing we want to do is verify that all of the data we're working with is in the same coordinate system. That is not required. You can edit data that's in different coordinate systems. However, it's a recommended best practice to ensure that all of the data is in the same coordinate system. This will avoid errors in your data caused by unit conversions, the different transformations that get applied between one coordinate system and another, and so on. So generally speaking, we do want to put the data all in the same coordinate system. So how do we verify what coordinate system our data is in, and is it ready for editing? Well, one of the first things we can do is go into the contents pane here and click on the List by Editing button and look for any icons over here on the right hand side. You'll see this one next to World Imagery, the red dot with the white exclamation point. Anytime you see that, that means this is a non-editable layer. And I can hover my mouse over that icon and it'll tell me why it's not editable. So in this case, this one's a tiled surface layer, so it's not editable. That's a web layer, that's a raster format, and it's not editable in ArcGIS Pro as this particular type of web service. Other reasons that data or a layer may not be editable is it's in a non-editable format, meaning it's in something like an AutoCAD DWG or a MicroStation DGN or an Excel spreadsheet file. All of those are non-editable formats in ArcGIS Pro. Another thing that can cause a layer to not be editable is you don't have permissions to edit that particular layer, whether it's because of permissions on a folder, permissions on a web service, or permissions within the database itself. That's another reason that a layer may not be editable. And a third reason is that that layer takes part in something that is not editable by ArcGIS Pro, such as a geometric network. So that's something that can be created in a geodatabase, usually used with utilities, but ArcGIS Pro does not support editing of geometric networks, at least not now, not at the 2.4 version that's the most current as the time we shoot this demonstration. This would be something that we could check. If your data is in different coordinate systems, you will see a yellow triangle with a black exclamation point in it. That is a warning, and if you hover over it, it would tell you that, again, if the data is in different coordinate system, that's the case. As I said, you can still edit data, it's just not recommended. So that's one way you can check to see. Another way to check to see what coordinate system a layer is in is simply right-click on it in the contents pane, go to Properties, and then if you go to Source in the Properties, so there's Source, if I scroll down, you'll see Spatial Reference. This is your coordinate system. And as you scroll down, you can see what coordinate system it's in, and then you can go one by one and check each individual layer that way. That's another way. Another method would be to see where it's coming from. So this is in the Tripville GIS database. So we see city limits, we see buildings, we see parcels, manholes, and sewer lines. So if I go over here into the catalog pane, there's the Tripville GIS database. If I expand it, you can see here's a featured data set. And within this featured data set, there's the city limits, there's the buildings, there's the parcels. Now the sewer lines and manholes are not in this feature data set. But one thing that is true about any feature class in a feature data set is that they all share the same coordinate system. So I know by looking at this that the parcels, the city limits, and the buildings all are in the same coordinate system. And if I expand the sewer feature data set, I can see there's the manhole, there's the sewer lines. So I know that these are in the same coordinate system with themselves. Now we don't know if the base feature data set and the sewer feature data set share the same coordinate system. But again, we can right click on it, go to Properties, look at the spatial reference. We see this is in NAD 83, State Plane, Georgia West, FIPS 1002. And if I go up here to base and go to its properties. Again, spatial reference. I can see, again, NAD 1983, State Plane, Georgia West, FIPS 1002. So, because we know these two feature data sets are in the same coordinate system, we know any feature class that references or is inside this feature data set and this one are all in the same coordinate system. So that's the first step. We verified everything is in the same coordinate system and we're good to go there. The next step is we want to often simplify the attribute table. There are fields in a table. So for example, we'll go ahead and open the attribute table for the manhole layer here. I simply right-clicked on that layer and went to attribute table, and you can see it opened it up down here. So there's a field down here. There's an object ID field, for example. That's one that I can't edit. It's maintained by the software itself, not something that I can change. And really, from my perspective as a user, really doesn't mean a whole lot. Shape field, right? It's a point, yes, but I can tell that by looking up here and see that that's a point. So, these are two fields that I don't necessarily need to see while I'm editing. So it's always a good idea to turn off fields that you don't need. So to do that, I'm going to go back up here, make sure the layer is selected, go to my data tab, go to the fields button here in the design group, and it opens up that table in design view. So I can go in and see there's a column here called visible. This will just basically turn that field on or off. Is it visible or not? So again, I don't need to see the object ID. It doesn't really mean anything to me. I don't need to see the shape field. So I can turn those off. Okay. You'll notice that somebody has already turned off some fields. So these near fids, near distance, near X and near Y, near angle. Somebody's going to turn those off so they weren't visible. So they were already fields that were hidden here. I can also go in and mark some fields as read-only. Maybe they're fields that I don't want to edit. I need to verify I have the right feature selected, but I'm not responsible for maintaining, or I don't want to accidentally change value. Well, I can go ahead and mark that field as read-only so that I can see it. I can see the values in it, but I can't accidentally change it. Because remember, in ArcGIS Pro, you're always able to edit data. This is different from the older ArcMap software that ArcPro is replacing. Okay? In ArcMap, you actually had to start and stop an edit session, but in ArcPro, that's not the case. You're always able to edit. So you don't want to leave something open accidentally that you don't need to edit. So marking something as read-only is a good idea. You can always change this. This doesn't change your permissions or capabilities. You can always come in and unmark the read-only attribute and go from there. So we'll leave it set the way it is, and then I'm going to have to save these changes to apply the visibility and the read-only settings. Actually, any change I make in here, I'll have to save. So I'm going to hit the save button, and there we go. I can now close this. And you can see here with the manhole attribute table open that the shape field and the object ID field are now hidden. Here's the manhole ID field that I marked as read-only, and I cannot make any changes. I click on there. Unlike this one, I can come in and make some changes in the meter field or the condition field. I can do that, assuming it's an editable layer. There we go. Got to mark it as editable. Now I can go in and make changes, but the manhole field, ID field, I cannot type in. It won't take the change, and it won't save that when I go up and save my edits, which we'll talk about in a little bit. So now I'm going to go ahead and close that table out for a moment. We're almost ready. We've got our data basically prepped. The next thing we want to do is set our editing options and our project options. So if I go back up here to the project tab in the ribbon, go down to options here. So the first thing I want to look at is my units. So what units do I want to use? Well, this is going to be dependent on where you're working. If you're here in the United States, more than likely you're going to want to use US survey feet. There is going to be some caveats to that. For example, if you're in South Carolina, working in South Carolina's state plane coordinate system with NAD 83, you're going to want to use the international foot. But most other places within the U.S. are going to use U.S. survey feet. Of course, if you're working up in Canada or outside the U.S., you're going to probably want to use one of the metric units, such as meters, and get that set up. And you'd want to look at your angular units. So are you going to use decimal degrees, degrees meant seconds, radians, if you're doing any sort of angular input from that. If you're inputting things by area, again, do you want to use US survey feet, international feet, or are you going to be using acres? Or again, if you're in the metric system, square meters, square kilometers, whatnot, again, make sure you go through and set up all these various units that you'll need to do. Once you've verified those, now we're going to go down to our editing options. And then this is really going to depend somewhat on your own personal preference. Dynamic constraints. And there's another way to turn this on and off that I'll show you. But this basically, as you move your mouse pointer away from the last point you drew, it's going to show you on screen the distance and angle from that last point to the location of your mouse pointer. So you can turn that on or off here. Again, there's another place to do that, which we'll show you. If you're drawing new features, drawing sketches, do you want to just be able to double click to finish that? If you're working on a touchscreen device, such as a Microsoft Surface Pro, for example, and you want to be able to use the screen with a stylus to edit data, you can enable that here. Now, again, it actually has to be a touchscreen device. This doesn't take a non-touchscreen device and suddenly make it one. So we'll do that. Other options like showing your full symbology as you're editing, that editing toolbar, which we'll look at later. Do you want it on, and where do you want it positioned, and so on with that. Other things you can go down here and set is, do you want to have an autosave? So Arc Pro by default doesn't automatically save your edits. You have to manually hit the Save Edits button, which we'll talk about in a minute. But you can enable an autosave. One thing to keep in mind if you enable autosave, you can only undo to the last point you saved. So if you make a mistake and you have autosave enabled and it saves before you can click the undo button, that mistake is now saved and you'd have to manually go through and change it back or get a backup of the data or something like that. So be careful when using the autosave. New users do tend to like it because every other application, Excel, Word, PowerPoint, even AutoCAD, has an autosave function. If you do turn it on, you can choose how frequently it saves by setting either a time interval or a number of operations interval. Do not set that too low. You don't need to be saving every minute. Set it to some threshold which you're comfortable with losing data. To me, if I lose 30 minutes worth of work, that's okay. I can redo it. It's not a big deal. So set something, 15, 30 minutes, even possibly an hour if you're going to use the autosave. Also, you've got other things like when you click Save Edits, when you save edits when saving the project. That's what I mean. So if you enable this, when I go up and I click the save and it saves the project file, it's all going to also save any data edits that you've made, both spatial and attribute. So you can link those two saves together. Otherwise, they're separate. This will have a "Are you really sure?" box. When you save your edits, it gets "Are you sure you want to save?" If you discard edits, do you really want to discard edits? You can turn those on and off here as well. It'll also appear if you have autosave enabled. So if I enable autosave, when it goes to autosave, it's going to pop up that confirm save before it does it. Again, kind of a little bit of a protection in case you make a mistake. So again, you can change those. The other thing here, make newly added layers editable by default. That's entirely up to you. When you add a new layer to a map, by default, this is enabled. So it automatically becomes an editable layer. Again, keeping in mind that you're always able to edit data in ArcGIS Pro, you might want to uncheck that box. That way you can add a new layer and you're safe from accidentally making a change to it or something. You can always make it editable after the fact, and we'll talk about that in a minute. The rest of this deals with working in an enterprise database with multiple editors and dealing with versioning and things like that. We're not going to get into that in the level of this course. If you've worked in ArcMap before, these are the same. But once you've configured this, you can click OK and back out of the project tab back into the interface. Okay, So now we're really pretty much prepared to begin editing our data. We've gone in and set our editing options, our unit options. We verified everything's in the same coordinate system. There is one last thing we'll want to do for sure, and that is configure our snapping. So snapping, as we've talked, is how close you have to get to an existing feature to make it automatically connect in there. So to set the snapping options, if you go to the Edit tab, you'll see snapping right here. So this, if it's white like it is there, snapping is not turned on. If I click on it and it goes to blue, snapping is now turned on. To control where you snap, you click the little drop down arrow below the word snapping, and you can choose where along the features that you do. Do you want to snap to a point? Do you want to snap to the end point? A vertice along a line, just the edge of a line or polygon, the intersection of two lines or two polygons, the midpoint of a line or the side of a polygon, or the tangent to a polygon or a line. So you can control these here, so where you want to snap. Then you need to set the snapping tolerance. How close do I need to get to something in order to do that? And there's a couple of ways to do this. I want to zoom in a little bit here before I do set the snapping tolerance. So with 2.4 and later, you can actually click Set Snapping Tolerance, come into your map and actually draw how close you want to get. And notice it will tell you as you move your mouse pointer out how far you are. So you can draw it, get it where you want and click. The other way is the way I prefer, which is to go where it says Snapping Settings here. It opens the snapping settings window, and then I can change it to a specific value. And I like 10 map units. Now this particular map is in feet. You can see that down here at the bottom, that's in feet. So this is going to be in feet. You can choose to use pixels. That is the default, by the way. I don't like to use pixels because that's an arbitrary unit. It's going to vary from one computer to the next depending on their video card, their monitor, and the resolution that they're set to. So a pixel on my screen is not going to be the same as a pixel on your screen unless all of our machines are identical, and they're probably not. Whereas 10 map units is always going to be 10 map units regardless. So again, that's up to you what you want to do. You can also, if you're trying to edit 3D data in a 2D environment, you can snap to the Z so you get elevation right. And then as you go to snap, it pops up a snapping tip. And so you can control the color of that snap tip and whether you want to snap to your sketches or not from here. So now we're ready to begin editing. Now, usually the first step in editing is to go to the Edit tab, because here's where you're going to access a lot of your editing tools through ArcGIS Pro. The first group on this tab is the Clipboard. So this is where we can copy features or values from an attribute table and then paste them into some other location, just like you do in Word or Excel. So I can copy a feature from, say, a CAD file and actually paste it into one of my editable feature classes, or I can copy a value out of one cell in a table and paste it into another cell in a table. So again, standard Windows functionality. Now under the manage edit groups, this is where we get in. So this is where we save our edits. So all the edits we've done so far, if I want to save them, like demonstrating earlier in the table, this is where you're going to click to save. This is different than the save project. So save project is up here or under the project tab. Those do not save data edits, be it spatial or attribute edits. This is how we save those edits. I can also discard all of my edits up to the last time I saved by clicking here, and everything I've done gets erased. That's everything. Now, if I want to step back a series of edits, that's where the undo comes in. This allows me to go back 1, 2, 3, whatever changes I've done, steps I've accomplished, tasks I've done, whatever. This discards all edits. This is, one at a time, or back. You can select from the group and do it, that way too. So now if I want to work with topology, which we'll talk about in a later lesson, this is where I'm going to choose the topology, either no, work with a map, or in this case, the base geodatabase topology in there and set up topology options. Again, we'll talk about that in a future lesson. That I can see the status of my edits, so I can see just in this map, and I notice I can access any map in my project, so I can see I have one non-editable layer, and I can find out why, where it's coming from here. I can see any editable warnings, which I have none, and I have 5 editable layers, and I can see what workspace they're in. So this gives me the kind of status, and as I do edits, it'll show me the edits with those and whatnot. It just gives you an idea of the status of your edits as you're proceeding. The error inspector, this works with a geodatabase topology, and again, we'll talk about that in a future lesson, but it allows us to find errors in our data, spatial errors in our data. So I already talked about the snapping button. So our features, controlling features. So we've got the create features window, or I'm sorry, the create features button here. It opens the create features pane over here. So this allows me to get to the feature templates I use for creating new features. And we'll talk about that later on in this lesson and future lessons as well. So if I want to create a new apartment or a new residential building, I can access that tool here and then come in and say start digitizing a new residential building in here, and I'm just very quickly doing this. This is probably not really a residential building, but that's okay. And I'm very crudely doing this just so you see it. All right, so there I've drawn my new building. I know it's not very clean, but you get the idea. And that's going to be through this create features pane right here that you're going to access those. And again, we'll talk more about those later. This is also why you also want to verify the symbology is set up, because you'll notice these templates match the symbology over here in the contents pane. So that's another step in making sure everything is configured properly, is getting your symbology set up prior to editing data. So that's create features. Go ahead and close that pane. Modify features. This is where you can get to tools that allow you to modify an existing feature. So if I want to go in and say split a polygon, right? So I'm going to take the split, going to select, say it's this parcel here. Now that I've got it selected, I can come in and draw my split line. And now I've created 2 parcels out of that one. And I access that through the Modify Features pane. Now another way to access some of these same editing tools is through the Tools group here. So you can see that it gives graphic icons. So there's the split tool I just used. There's merge, reshape, vertices. And later in the course, you'll get an opportunity to use a large number of these tools. So you can kind of see some of the ones that are in there. Okay. So these tools, same as these tools, it doesn't matter which way you access them. And of course, we've got the good old delete button, which will actually delete. So they can see I deleted the 2 parcels that I had selected. And again, if I don't mean to, I can undo. So therefore, there I've undone that. Here's our selection. So this allows us to go in select features. And again, there is a drop down, rectangular, polygon, lasso, depending on the shape you want to go with. And if I just click into one like that, it does just the one. If I draw a shape, it can select multiple. You can also with that use your shift and control keys. So shift key to take or remove features from the list that you have selected. Of course, I can clear my entire selection by clicking that. Now keep in mind this tool works with the list by selection button on the content. So this is how you choose which layers are selectable. So now I've just got buildings, parcels. I turned off manholes and sewer lines. So if I draw a nice big box like so, even though I'm crossing parcels, buildings, manholes, sewer lines, notice that none of the sewer lines were selected and neither were the manholes. That's because they're listed as non-selectable here. Also, notice I just clicked in the parcel here, and I get this, what they call the selection chipette. This allows me, when I have two overlapping features, to decide which do I mean to select. Do I want to select the whole city limits or just that parcel? Okay, and that only works when you use a single click to select in an area. If I select a box, use a selection box, notice it doesn't ask, even though it selected 4 parcels and the city limits there. And that's because when you draw a box, the software assumes you mean to select multiple features. Okay. This is why when I'm editing, I like to make sure that I'm on the list by selection in the contents pane. That way I can verify what I have selected. Because if I were to say delete these parcels, they would go away, and maybe I intend for that to happen, but also the city limit would be deleted. And at the scale, and because the city limits are hollow, if we look at the symbology here, I don't realize I have those selected. So I would delete the city limits, and if I save that, then again, it would save that deletion, and you might not even realize you deleted it. So this is always a good place to be. So I'm going to clear that out. The other thing to remember is that the contents pane, you also have the list by editing. This is where you can control which layers are editable. So if you want to ensure that you don't edit anything, you may want to set these as non-editable, all of them. And at this point, even though I can select features, if I go in to try to edit, so say I click the merge tool, the designated layer type cannot be merged. Well, why is that? Well, that's, again, if I hover over that, it's because they're not editable. There's no editable layers. If I suddenly make those editable, then that should change. It should be allowed to do that. I may have to reselect them in here. And again, verify my selection. Oops, that's also because I have city limits here selected. So I want to clear that selection here. Now I can merge, because I can't merge city limits to 2 separate layers, right? So I can now merge those 2 parcels because they're editable and selectable, right? Again, if I uncheck that box, I get the error. So again, remember they must be selectable and editable for you to pick things in the map and begin editing them. Okay, so that's an important thing to know. Other groups we have within the Edit tab. So if we're working with 3D data, how do we assign the Z coordinate to data? Now, your data must be Z enabled for that to happen. We're not going to talk about how that occurs at this point, but just know it must be Z enabled for this to work. I don't have Z data, so that doesn't matter. If I want to do a ground to grid corrections, and then if I have the data reviewer extension, I can use that and the rules that are assigned in that for reviewing my data, make sure I've made my edits correctly. So that's a quick review of the editing toolbar. So I hope you have found that useful, and it really helps better explain the purpose of those tools. And if you have any questions, feel free to contact us. And now we'll move on to the rest of the lesson.